All right, next up we're going to string up a Prince 03 Tour Mid Plus. This frame came in 3 sizes, I think, the Mid Plus, and then the oversized. So the Mid Plus has a 16 by 18 pattern. This has, I know you can't see them because of the camera angle, but this has O ports in the sides as well as the top. And any rackets with the O ports presents a challenge. And I'm going to be dealing with this racket, even though I'm going to string it with a full bed of Babolat Excel, a multi-filament. Even though it's not a hybrid, and even though I could string it one piece, especially since these outer mains end at the head, it's, you know, the mains start at the head, 16 mains, the mains end back at the head, so it almost is begging for you to string it as a natural one-piece string job because your crosses naturally start at the top and go down. And if it was a racket without ports, that's probably what I would be doing. But because of the O ports on the sides, it presents a particular challenge. When you pull tension on your crosses, the string, your crosses, particularly the upper crosses, want to pull to the wrong side of the O port. And if you've never tried to string an O port racket, it might be hard for you to wrap your head around why the string wants to do that, and it's basically physics. So, like I said, even though this is going to be a full bed of Babolat Excel, I'm still going to string it 2-piece instead of 1-piece so that I can use the 50-50 pattern on the crosses. In other words, I won't be starting the crosses at the top the way I normally would. I'll actually be starting them in the center. It's very similar to starting the mains. Just like when we normally start our mains, we start in the center and work our way outward towards the edges. We'll be doing the same type of thing here with the crosses, starting in the middle, tensioning those crosses first, and then working our way a little bit up and a little bit down. To do the 50-50 method on these crosses, you need a starting clamp or 2. You can be done with 1 starting clamp, but if you have 2, you don't have to do the clamp dance quite as much. So, first let me show you what the problem is, sort of the issue with these Prince O ports. So let's say, on this particular racket, you wouldn't even have any issue until you get down to the 5th cross, because the first 4 crosses run through normal grommets. And so we'll cover the physics in a moment, but basically let's run this green string through here as if it was the 5th cross, which would be going in that direction, and it comes out this O port over here. So let's presume that I've got the first 4 crosses installed, and now this is going to be the 5th cross. But you'll notice now, because of the way the turntable pivots, and there's a big, I know you can't see the O port, but the O port is right here. When there's tension on this string wants to move to that side of the O port. So obviously you can't clamp that string. It's running diagonal from the edge of this O port to the edge of this O port. In other words, it doesn't stay where you want it. It always wants to do that, at least until you get down past the midpoint of the frame. So you'll have this issue as you continue further and further down. For example, till you get to about where the center of the racket is. Eventually, eventually once you get past the middle, not so much the middle of the racket, but the middle of the turntable, because this is where the pivot point is, that this tension string that's running to your tensioner always wants to line up with this spot where it pivots. And that's what makes the racket kind of turn a little bit. So for example, if I were actually tensioning this green string, you can see that that string doesn't stay here. I've left this racket strung for the time being so that you can see where these strings are supposed to be. If this was an empty hoop, you might not be able to tell if that string's running at a diagonal. So the green string should be on top of the orange string like that. But instead of it staying there, because we still, even with the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, even this 9th cross that we're simulating right here, it's still not far enough down in the hoop to pass this pivot point down here. So even this cross, the 9th cross, wants to jump to the opposite side of the O port. And so usually about the time you get to the 11th cross, it'll run pretty straight. And you can keep that pretty straight there. And then as you get towards the bottom, the problem goes away entirely because the strings naturally want to pull towards the bottom of the O ports instead of the top of the O ports. Like this. So the string will always deflect here at the grommet. And you don't ever see this on a normal racket because a normal grommet, the string bends at the frame. On these early crosses, the string still bends at the frame before it runs straight to the tensioner. But you don't really ever take notice of it because it always stays exactly where you need it to due to a normal grommet. But once you have these big O ports, the string wants to move to the most inopportune of places. So let's cover the physics of this just for a moment. And if I put a regular racket on here for a moment, you'll see some of the basic physics of how tension strings line up. So on a normal racket like this with standard grommets, when you're pulling the central mains, the strings essentially run straight through the hoop and straight to the tensioner. For example, if I run a center main here through the frame, and we pretend that we're tensioning it, it goes to the tension head. That string doesn't really deflect left or right as it exits that grommet. In other words, it's not doing this or this. It just goes straight to the tension head. And as you get further and further away from the center, of course, the strings do have to deflect a little bit. So for example, when you get out here to maybe the 5th or the 6th main, the main is straight in the hoop, but when you tension it, you'll notice that there's an angle. It changes here. So there's basically more and more deflection. I'm exaggerating that. And that happens as you get towards the edges of the mains. And the same thing applies to the crosses. So for example, when you're pulling, like this racket, or this one doesn't have 19 crosses, but if it did, and let's just say that this was the 10th cross in the dead center of the racket, it's a very straight pull, and the string does not have to deflect this way or this way. But when you're installing crosses near the top of the frame, and then you tension it, you'll notice that there's quite an angle change here. That has to deflect because this string is trying to line up with this point on the turntable. And that's why when you're pulling the central ones, everything stays straight because that string is already running above that pivot point. And when you string bottom crosses, the same type of thing happens too. That's why the racket pivots like that. So you'll notice that this string that we're tensioning is not running, it's not lining up with the tension head. This string always does, but this string always wants to line up with the pivot point here, which is not necessarily the center of the hoop. So it's also important that when you mount a frame, you want these two towers to be equidistant from this pivot point. You're trying to get the center of the hoop as centrally located over this pivot point as possible. Now, this particular machine makes an easy task of that because these towers move towards one another and apart simultaneously. I don't have to adjust one, you know, loosen something over here, shift this in and shift that. So don't just move one tower and not the other. Don't have your, in other words, don't mount your racket so it's shifted way over here. You've got your one tower way towards the end of the turntable and this one positioned very far in, because then the pivot point is way down here in the lower portion of the hoop, and vice versa if you shift it this way and had your towers or your mounting adjusted like that. This machine you can't do that, because as you turn this knob, both of these towers are moving towards one another on the same screw that's inside the turntable. So these are moving together or apart. So it's really nice because it always perfectly centers any racket that you put on there. So I don't ever have to worry about that. But I'm just showing you that this pivot point in the center of the turntable is where the string that's being tensioned wants to line up with, and that's what forces the racket to turn a little bit when you're tensioning upper crosses, lower crosses, outer mains, and things like that. So if we put this back on here for the moment, so the hoop is as centered as possible here. And now you can see why the strings pull towards the wrong part of the hole, at least early on. So if you string this one piece with the crosses starting at the top, you're fighting a losing battle here of the string trying to go to the opposite side of the hole. So people, or if you're stringing it two-piece and you use a starting knot or a starting clamp to anchor the top cross in the way most of us normally do a two-piece, same problem is basically when you try to tension these strings beginning at the top and go down, whether it's one piece or two piece, this problem arises. So people have come up with all sorts of creative ways to try to force that string to stay in the proper side of the O port. And one of the ways that, so at some point someone came up with an idea of using an S hook so that when they were tensioning, by the way, here's how to identify, like I said, the first four crosses on this particular frame, that you wouldn't notice anything. It was not until you get to the fifth one. So the phenomenon will start to occur on the first O port that you come to, that you're exiting the O port from the inside of the hoop to the outside of the hoop. So you're exiting an O port, the first O port that you exit is where you'll start having this phenomenon occur. So for example, on this racket, the highest O port on this side is over here, and the highest O port on this side is over here. So this one you will encounter first. However, the first time you encountered this particular O port, the third cross goes that way, the fourth one goes in, so you're entering it. And when you're entering it, it'll stay where it needs to go. So, for example, that string won't be a problem. Now over here, it exits a regular grommet, so it would stay put, and then this would loop around again into the first O port on this side, but again, we're entering that O port, not exiting it. So you wouldn't have any issues tensioning this fourth main or anything like that. And so then when you came to this fifth main, that's the very first time that you would be taking the end of the string and exiting an O port from the inside of the frame, inside of the hoop, towards the outside. And that's the one that when you go to tension it would want to raise up to the top of the O port. So that's how you identify where your problems are going to start to occur. I mean, as soon as you start to tension the string, you'll see it, but I'm saying if you want to figure it out in advance, it's look for the O port that you will come to first, exiting. At any rate, so if we simulate this fifth cross being pulled, as we've already established, this string wants to pull to that side of the O port. So Prince used to offer up or sell little tools, little plastic rubbery gizmos shaped kind of like a boomerang that they called a boomerang. And you inserted it into the O port and ran the string through it, and basically it sort of tried to force the string to stay on this side of the O port. It's kind of a difficult thing to explain. But sometimes they would stay put, sometimes they would go flying across the room once tension was applied. You had to have different colored ones because the O ports, the size of the O ports aren't the same on all of the rackets with O ports. So there was a white boomerang and an orange boomerang and a red boomerang and a black boomerang and all these different colors. And so you had to have like a whole keychain full of boomerangs so that you'd be equipped, be prepared to use a boomerang for whatever racket came your way. Well, people started coming up with, inventive ways to force this string to stay here without using the boomerang. And the first thing is when they would tension the string and see how it goes to the wrong part, is they would use the hip method, where they would press their hip against the turntable or the handle of the racket if the handle's facing you, and you would, before applying tension, you would use your hip to push on the turntable like this, so that the deflection of the string didn't occur here at the O port. You notice if I push with my hip here, if I push far enough, that string will end up where you want it, over here on this side of the O port. The bad part of that, hopefully it's on camera, is that you're changing the deflection point from here to now over here. And now my tension head has a Diablo, but a lot of them would just go straight to a gripper. Especially if you have like a crank machine. A lot of crank machines don't have a Diablo or a roller guide, and you're just going straight into a gripper. So like if you have like a Prince Neos, it's just right into a gripper for most crank machines. And so when you have this string here like this, and then you push with your hip, you're changing, you're maybe sort of rectifying a problem over here, but you're creating a new problem over here because the string is now deflecting and making a weird angle into the gripper over here. And if you're working with a sensitive string like I'm about to use, that could damage the string or natural gut. Obviously, if you have a Diablo, it prevents the damage to the string, and it does keep this section of the string running straight into the gripper. But when you press with your hip, you're creating an angle over here, and this is creating some sideways torsional forces on this tension head, which it was never designed to sustain. Maybe your tension head will be fine, but maybe it won't. And so over time, if you string enough O-port rackets and you keep applying all this sideways torque on this tension head that was really designed to just be pulled linearly in that direction only, it could damage the tension head. So this hip method is not a great idea because it gets the string where you want, but it creates another problem over here. So that was the hip method. Then people started coming up with other ideas, such as using a metal S-hook, which you could, maybe put inside of one of the neighboring O ports nearby, and then run your string around the S-hook like this. And so this does accomplish getting this string in the bottom of the O port where you want it, and it doesn't create the sideways torsional forces over here on the tension head, but you create a lot of friction here, and it has to be just the right size S hook, and sometimes it lines up straighter than this, sometimes it lines up, and also you could potentially damage the finish on the frame with the metal S hooks. And the spacing is always different. Like I said, this happens to be the O3 Tour with the orange, but it's got smaller O ports. Some of them had bigger O ports. You might be able to get away with this, but eventually, like this one, I can fit this through the bottom O port, but I can't get it to this position. So this solution doesn't really work. It certainly doesn't work all the time on all the various O port rackets. But that was the S hook idea, is basically create something that this string could hook around, which would force it to stay put before going over to the tension head. Then there was the Sharpie cap idea, where you took the cap off of a Sharpie, and prior to tensioning the string and allowing it to jump up here, now keep in mind that these first 4 crosses would already be in place, is you take this Sharpie cap and stick it in between the string you were about to tension and a previously tensioned string, so that when it pulled tension, it helped hold that string more where it needed to stay. The problem with that, it kind of works, but you can see that this little pie wedge of string here still moves towards the opposite side of the O port. The bigger problem is when you go to clamp the string off, you can't really clamp it very well because, well, there's a pin cap in your way. Likewise, somebody else came up with a good idea, what seemed like a good idea, which was to take an old school round style clothespin like this and place that over the outer main, which kind of does the same thing as the pen cap, as it keeps this string running straight rather than jumping to here. It forces it, and with the slot on this, it was a little bit better idea than the Sharpie cap, because that's not going to fall out of place. It's going to stay put until you move it, and it forces the string around it. But again, you run into the same problem: is how do you get the clamp right here on this string while that's there? Because if you take that out of the way, the string is going to move. So kind of half-cooked ideas. Good thinking, but in practicality, it doesn't really work so well. Likewise, I thought, well, you know, maybe I came up with a good idea, is using a flying clamp that's got a substantial amount of spacing here between it, and not actually clamping the string with this, but just basically using this as a spacer, so that prior to tensioning this string, you could place this here, which would do something similar to the clothespin and the Sharpie cap. That would keep the string well away from the fourth cross or jumping to the top of the O port by keeping it like this, and then you would tension it. But you have the very same problem that I just mentioned, is with this already in the way, you can't get your fixed machine clamp on the end of the string. With all of these ideas, with the Sharpie cap, with the clothespin idea, or with this flying clamp idea, yes, if you move it far enough in from the edge, like this, if I'm willing to put that all the way over here, then yes, it would keep that string where you want it and leave enough room, possibly, to get this clamp up here on that string, but it's still never quite where you want it. So that's not a great solution either. So the S-hook, the Sharpie cap, the clothespin, the flying clamp, basically anything that works as a spacer here would keep the string there, but it becomes the problem is inherently when you go to actually place the string clamp on there, you can't get the clamp there because something else is in its way. That's where that hip method seemed to work quite nicely, because people thought the hip method was going to be the solution, because the string was held where you wanted it, so for example, this string that wants to jump up here, if I put my hip on this side of the handle, you can see that you can push it over there and you can get the clamp on there, so now you don't have clamp interference, but you have the same angle issue over here at the tensioner. So basically, the solution is, or at least I always feel that the best solution thus far, is to string the crosses from the center outward, which is okay by Prince. That doesn't void the warranty or anything like that. And you don't have to fight. The string will naturally always pull, so from roughly the midpoint of the turntable going down, the lower strings always want to pull to the bottom of the O ports, which is where they naturally need to go. And when you're stringing from here going upwards, the string always pulls and resides in the upper portion of the O ports where you want it to go. So the string naturally, due to the physics of the way the strings pull and change angle at the edge of the frame, they always go right where you need them to go. It's just that you have to start in the center and go up with half of the string and down with half of the string. So I'm going to get the strings cut out of this frame, and 18 feet of Babolat XL cut out of the reel for the mains, and 16.5 feet cut out of the reel for the crosses, and then I'll show you how to, I'm going to be using the 2 starting clamps so that I don't have to do the clamp dance quite as much when I'm doing the crosses, but you'll see how the 50-50 crosses works out. And because these have O ports, there's a good video out there by YU Little on how to do the 50-50 pattern, but he's not doing it on an O port racket, so he is using a starting clamp to demonstrate it, but he's just got the starting clamp up against the frame, and on a regular grommet that would work, but on O ports, especially the larger O ports, this starting clamp may not sit flush on the frame. It'll rock, it'll change and have some funky angles, especially on the really large O ports. So in those cases, when I'm doing an O port racket 50-50 like this, I use 2 old school clothespins that are flat, not round but flat, because I'm going to use the flat aspect of it to sit against the edge of the frame. In other words, I'm kind of using this like a Parnell pad. For those of you familiar with the Parnell pad, a little piece of leather with a slot cut in it so that you can place a starting clamp on the outside of the frame without damaging the finish. So I'll be using this as a little spacer and protector whenever I have the starting clamp, and I'll have to move that around, so you'll see me tension a string, place this on the outside of the frame, put the starting clamp there to hold progress so that we can move the machine clamps around. So I'll use 2 starting clamps and 2 of these flat clothespins when I'm doing the crosses. But let me get the strings cut out of this, remounted, and cut off the 18 feet and the 16.5 feet, and you'll kind of see how it all works out.